Now put those ideas together. Motivated reasoning, identity protective cognition, and system justification. What do you get? A recipe for deflection. Not because people are stupid, not because people are incapable of growth, because our brains often try to protect our identity before they pursue uncomfortable truths. Here's the problem. That instinct might protect our ego, but it doesn't solve public policy. Hospitals don't care about your identity. Housing policy doesn't care about your identity. The justice system cares about your identity. And there's a sector of deflection that refuses to solve that. But we'll talk about that later. Right now, the outcomes are the outcomes. So let's test the theory. Let's see what happens when evidence enters the room. According to the CDC, Black women in the United States are several times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. Researchers found that this disparity persists even after accounting for factors such as income and education. That's the evidence. Now notice what often happens next. Do we ask, why is this happening? Or do we immediately ask, are you saying doctors are racist? Those are two completely different questions. One examines a documented disparity. The other redirects the conversation. I want to play a game. Every time I present a piece of evidence today, don't listen to me. Listen to what happens next. I'll mention a documented disparity, and sometimes I'll change the subject. I'll mention a study, and somebody will make it about intentions. I'll mention policy, and somebody will make it about personalities. By the end of this episode, I want you to ask yourself one question. Why is it so hard for us to stay with the evidence? Not because disagreement is bad. Disagreement is healthy. Deflection isn't. Because every moment we spend arguing about whether someone feels accused is another minute we don't spend solving the problem that started the conversation. And people pay the price for that. Not in feelings, in lives. So today, we're not talking about whether you're a good person. We're talking about what happens when evidence collides with identity. Because if we can't stay with the evidence, we'll never solve the problem the evidence is pointing to. Welcome to You Ought to Know Better, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. Let's get into it. Before we talk about politics, let's talk about people. Because this isn't just a political problem. It's a human one. In 1990, a psychologist by the name of Dr. Ziva Kunda published one of the most influential papers in social psychology, The Case for Motivated Reasoning. And her conclusion? Human beings often don't start with the evidence. We start with the conclusion we want. Then our brains go looking for reasons to support it. That's motivated reasoning. Then you have Dr. Dan Kahan, at Yale Law School. His research on identity protective cognition found that when information threatens a group's identity, people often become more likely to defend the group than evaluate the evidence itself. Think about that. If evidence feels like it's criticizing, quote, my people, my side, or people like me, the instinct isn't always curiosity. It's protection. Psychologist Dr. John Jost, Dr. Mahzarin Banaji developed system justification theory. Their research says that people are often motivated to defend existing social systems because believing the system is fundamentally fair feels safer than questioning it. Now put those ideas together. Motivated reasoning, identity protective cognition, and system justification. What do you get? A recipe for deflection. Not because people are stupid, not because people are incapable of growth, because our brains often try to protect our identity before they pursue uncomfortable truths. Here's the problem. That instinct might protect our ego, but it doesn't solve public policy. Hospitals don't care about your identity. Housing policy doesn't care about your identity. The justice system cares about your identity. And there's a sector of deflection that refuses to solve that. But we'll talk about that later. Right now, the outcomes are the outcomes. So let's test the theory. Let's see what happens when evidence enters the room. According to the CDC, Black women in the United States are several times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. Researchers found that this disparity persists even after accounting for factors such as income and education. That's the evidence. Now notice what often happens next. Do we ask, why is this happening? Or do we immediately ask, are you saying doctors are racist? Those are two completely different questions. One examines a documented disparity. The other redirects the conversation away from the disparity. And that's today's episode. Not disagreement, deflection. Because if we never stay with the original question, we never solve the original problem. Now let's move on to housing. Because if you want to understand wealth in America, you have to understand home ownership. For most Americans, a home isn't just where you live. It's the biggest investment you'll ever make. It's how equity is built, how businesses get started. It's how colleges get paid for. It's how wealth gets passed from one generation to the next. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created residential security maps that graded neighborhoods for mortgage lending risk. Neighborhoods with large Black populations were often rated as hazardous. And those maps influenced lending decisions for decades. Historians, the National Archives, and decades of scholarship have documented how these practices help limit access to federally backed mortgages for many Black families. Then came the GI Bill. While the law itself didn't explicitly exclude Black veterans, many benefits were administered locally. In practice, discriminatory lending, segregation, and unequal access meant many black veterans were unable to receive the same housing opportunities as white veterans. So here's the question. If one group had greater access to appreciating property for decades, and another group faced substantial barriers to that same opportunity, would you expect those families to have the same accumulated wealth generations later? The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances consistently found large racial wealth gaps in the United States. Now, watch what happens next. Hold on to that receipt. Because instead of asking, how did those housing policies affect generational wealth? The conversation often becomes, well, my family was poor too. Maybe they were. That doesn't answer the question. Both things can be true. Your family may have struggled. And discriminatory housing policies may have shaped opportunities for millions of Americans. Those aren't competing facts. They're different facts. Notice the pattern? We moved from a discussion about documented federal housing policy to a discussion about individual family stories. That's deflection. Not because individual stories don't matter. They do. But personal anecdotes can erase population-level evidence. Political psychologists would tell us this in exactly what identity protective reasoning looks like. When evidence feels personal, we often respond with our own personal story. The problem is, public policy isn't evaluated one anecdote at a time. It's evaluated by looking at patterns. That's why researchers study populations. That's why historians examine archives. That's why economists analyze decades of data. Because they're trying to answer a policy question, not settle an argument at the family reunion. And here's the cost. If we spend all our time debating whose grandparents had it harder, we never examine whether past housing policy continues to influence opportunity today. The conversation shifts. The policy disappears. And once the policy disappears, so does the possibility of fixing it. That's the cost of deflection. Not that someone won an argument, that a documented problem never got the attention it deserved. All right, let's try another one. In 2017, the U.S. Sentencing Commission published a comprehensive report examining sentencing in the federal courts. After accounting for factors like criminal history, offense characteristics, and other legally relevant variables, the commission found that black men received sentences that were on average about 19% longer than similarly situated white men. Not Twitter, not TikTok. The United States Sentencing Commission. That's the receipt. Now, watch what happens next. Instead of asking, why does this disparity exist? The conversation often becomes, well, what about black on black crime? That's a different conversation. Violence within communities is real. And proximity crime says every race kills at about the same rate. Victims deserve justice. Communities deserve safety. But neighborhood crime patterns don't answer whether simply situated defendants receive different sentences in federal court. Those are separate questions. When one question gets replaced with another, the first question never gets answered. That's deflection. And when the question never gets answered, the policy rarely gets examined. which means the disparity remains. Watch what happens next. So let's keep going. Public education. One of the greatest promises America ever made. The idea that no matter where you're born, you should have the opportunity to learn. Now here's the receipt. The U.S. Department of Education, the Government Accountability Office, and decades of education researchers have documented that schools serving larger portions of students of color and students from low-income families are more likely to experience concentrated poverty and resource disparities. School funding systems vary by state, but in many places, local property wealth still plays a big role in what schools can provide. That's the receipt. Now, watch what happens next. Instead of asking, why do these disparities exist? The conversation becomes, well, if parents cared more, maybe parental involvement matters. Research says it does. But that still doesn't answer the question. If one school has advanced placement courses, new science labs, experienced teachers, a functioning library, smaller class sizes, and another school is struggling to provide those same opportunities, asking why isn't an attack, it's accountability. Because here's the thing we love telling children. You can be anything you want to be. But opportunity isn't just about talent. It's also about access. Access to experienced teachers, access to rigorous coursework, access to counselors, access to technology, access to safe learning environments. Those things matter. The research has been saying they matter for decades. So watch what happens next. When someone asks why educational opportunities aren't distributed equally, do we investigate the policies? Or do we immediately make it about individual character? Because if we reduce every policy discussion to individual choices, we'll never ask whether the system itself can be improved. And if we never ask, we never fix it. Watch what happens next. By now, I hope you've noticed the pattern. It wasn't about one issue. It wasn't about one policy. It wasn't even about one political party. The pattern was the response. Present the evidence. Watch what happens next. Change the subject. Question the motive. Debate the messenger. Protect the identity. And forget the original question. Over and over and over again. Here's why that matters. Public policy only changes when the public agrees there's a problem we're solving. If the conversation never stays on the problem, nothing changes. If every discussion about maternal mortality becomes a debate about intentions, the mothers are still dying. If every discussion about housing becomes a debate about individual success stories, families are still living with the consequences of decades of documented policy. If every discussion about sentencing disparities becomes a debate about something else, the justice system never has to answer the original question. If every discussion about violent extremism becomes an argument about whether talking about it is divisive, the threat doesn't disappear. The conversation does. That's why deflection isn't harmless. It consumes the time we should be spending solving problems. Think about it. How many times have you watched an interview where someone was asked a direct question and somehow, 5 minutes later, nobody remembers what the original question was? Politics, media, social media, they're all full of that. Outrage gets clicks. Deflection gets applause. Answers? Not so much. And that's dangerous. Because democracy depends on an informed public, not a distracted one. So the next time you hear someone present evidence, pause. Before you decide whether you agree, before you decide whether you disagree, ask yourself one question. Did we stay with the evidence? Or did we leave it behind? Because if we can't stay with the evidence, we can't follow it. If we can't follow it, we can't understand it. And if we can't understand it, we have no chance of fixing what's broken. That's why this matters. Not because it's comfortable, not because it's easy, but because people are living with the consequences while the rest of us argue about whether we should even be having the conversation. The receipts don't care who they make uncomfortable. They're receipts. Our job isn't to protect ourselves from the evidence. Our job is to have the courage to examine it. That's how problems get solved. That's how policy gets better. And that's how a democracy is supposed to work. At the beginning of this episode, I told you we were going to play a game. Not to see whether you agreed with me, not to see whether you changed your political party, not to see whether you liked me. I asked you to watch for a pattern, a piece of evidence, a change of subject, a question left unanswered, then another, and another. The point wasn't that every disagreement is deflection. People should disagree. People should challenge evidence. People should ask hard questions. That's how democracy works. But there's a difference between challenging evidence and refusing to engage with it. There's a difference between asking for more proof and changing the subject before the proof is even discussed. Because here's the thing. Evidence doesn't ask us to surrender our identity. It asks us to examine reality. Sometimes reality confirms what we already believed. Sometimes it challenges us. That's true whether we're talking about race, healthcare, education, criminal justice, housing, or any other issue that might shape a person's life. The question isn't whether the conversation makes us comfortable. The question is whether it moves us closer to the truth. Because truth doesn't become less true because it makes us uncomfortable. And it doesn't become more false because someone changed the subject. So the next time you're watching the news, listening to a debate, scrolling through social media, or sitting across from someone at dinner, don't just listen to what's being said. Pay attention to what happens after the evidence is presented. Did the conversation stay with the question, or did it run from it? Because if we keep running from the evidence, we'll keep running from the solutions. And people living with the consequences of those problems don't have that luxury. This has been You Ought to Know Better. I'm AJ Miller. You might know me as Unicorn. Thank you for reading the fine print with me, checking the receipts, and investigating the asterisk. Until next time, Stay curious. Stay informed. And the next time someone presents evidence, watch what happens next. Good night. Maybe it's your grandmother. Isn't rich. The woman who worked her entire life. The myth of meritocracy. The hardest working person I know isn't rich. Maybe yours isn't either. Maybe it's your grandmother. The woman who worked her entire life and still died owing somebody money. Maybe it's your mother. The woman who stretched groceries, stretched paychecks, stretched herself so far that exhaustion became part of her personality. Maybe it's the warehouse worker whose knees gave out before they could retire. The nursing assistant lifting people twice her size for wages that barely cover rent. The home health aide caring for someone else's parent while praying her own lights stay on. The single mother working 2 jobs, skipping meals, losing sleep, doing everything society told her to do, and still falling behind. You know that person. I know that person. Maybe you're that person. America is full of that person. And that's a problem. Because from the time we're children, we're taught that success belongs to the people who earn it. Work hard, sacrifice, stay out of trouble, play by the rules. And eventually, you'll get what you deserve. That's the promise. But see, promises are funny things. Because eventually, reality shows up and she starts asking questions. Questions the story can't answer. Like, why some of the hard... The myth of meritocracy. The hardest working person I know isn't rich. Maybe yours isn't either. Maybe it's your grandmother. The woman who worked her entire life and still died owing somebody money. Maybe it's your mother. The woman who stretched groceries, stretched paychecks, stretched herself so far that exhaustion became part of her personality. Maybe it's the warehouse worker whose knees gave out before they could retire. The nursing assistant lifting people twice her size for wages that barely cover rent. The home health aide caring for someone else's parent while praying her own lights stay on. The single mother working 2 jobs, skipping meals, losing sleep, doing everything society told her to do, and still falling behind. You know that person. I know that person. Maybe you're that person. America is full of that person. And that's a problem. Because from the time we're children, we're taught that success belongs to the people who earn it. Work hard, sacrifice, stay out of trouble, play by the rules. And eventually, you'll get what you deserve. That's the promise. But see, promises are funny things. Because eventually, reality shows up and she starts asking questions. Questions the story can't answer. Like, why some of the hardest working people in this country are one emergency away from disaster. Why the people cleaning the buildings make less than the people sitting in them. Why the people caring for the sick struggle to afford health care. Why the people feeding Americans struggle to feed themselves. And let's be honest, we don't like those questions. Because those questions force us to confront something uncomfortable. If hard work alone determines success, the hardest working people in America would be the richest. I like those questions, but they're not. Because those questions, not even close. Not by a long shot. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee it. Tonight we're talking about meritocracy. The promise. The myth. And the asterisk. Welcome to You Ought to Know Better. I'm AJ Miller. This is the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Let's start with the story. Because meritocracy is one of the most powerful stories America has ever told itself. Work hard, make good choices, stay disciplined, success will follow. It's simple. It's hopeful. And if we're being honest, it's comfortable. Because if success is earned, then life makes sense. The winners earned it, the losers didn't. The rich deserved it, the struggling need to work harder. It's clean, it's neat, it's easy. But there's a problem. The numbers keep interrupting the story. And the answers to those questions don't add up. So let's talk about wealth. Not income, wealth. Because they're not the same thing. Income is what comes into your house. Wealth is what stays there. The home, the savings accounts, the investments, the inheritance. The thing that catches you when life decides to throw a punch. According to the Federal Reserve's 2022 survey of consumer finances, the median white family held approximately $285,000 in wealth. The median black family held approximately $45,000. That's almost a $240,000 gap. And before y'all come in my comments saying, well, maybe one group just worked harder, let's stop right there. Because wealth isn't just earned, it's inherited. Which raises a question that meritocracy has always struggled to answer. What exactly did a newborn do to earn an inheritance? Nothing. A child born into wealth didn't earn wealth. A child born into poverty didn't earn poverty. Yet both inherit consequences before they can read, before they can walk, before they can make a single decision for themselves. And that's where the story starts cracking. Because meritocracy asks us to focus on effort. Reality keeps forcing us to acknowledge access. And this is where people usually say, that was a long time ago. Redlining was decades ago. Segregation was decades ago. Housing discrimination was decades ago. Fair enough. But let's talk about why that matters. Because when most people hear the word history, they think about the past. What they don't realize is that history has a habit of showing up in the present. Imagine 2 families, 1950. One family is allowed to buy a home in a growing neighborhood, bustling with neighbors and suburbs and businesses and doctor's offices and amazing infrastructure. The other family is denied access to that same opportunity. The first family builds equity. The home increases in value. That equity helps pay for college, helps start businesses, helps survive emergencies, helps create inheritances. The second family never gets that same foothold. Now fast forward 70 years. We're not looking at 2 individuals anymore. We're now looking at generations. One family has assets that can be passed down. The other family has spent generations trying to build what the first family was allowed to accumulate. The law changed. The consequences didn't. Because wealth has grandchildren, but so does poverty. History doesn't have to be alive to affect the present. Its receipts are already here. And those receipts show up in the numbers. Think about homeownership. For most middle-class families, a home isn't just a place to live. It's the largest generational wealth-building tool they will ever own. According to census data, almost 74% of white households own their homes. For black households, it's about 45%. That's nearly a 30-point gap in one of the primary ways Americans build wealth. And that gap didn't appear out of thin air. History leaves fingerprints, even when the person who left them is long gone. Now let's talk about opportunity. Because meritocracy assumes opportunity follows talent. Work hard, get qualified, the door's open, that's the story. But what happens if the door is making decisions before it even knows your qualifications? In 2003, economists Marianne Bertrand and Cindile Mullinath conducted one of the most influential hiring studies in modern America. They sent thousands of resumes to employers. Same education, same experience, same qualifications. The only thing they changed was the name. Some resumes had names like Emily and Greg. Others had names like Lakeisha and Jamal. The results were very, very difficult to ignore. Resumes with traditionally white-sounding names received approximately 50% more callbacks than identical resumes with traditionally black-sounding names. Same resume, same qualifications, different opportunity. Think about what that means. The interview wasn't lost because of performance. The interview was lost before performance ever entered the room. And before somebody says, well, that study is 20 years old. Researchers have continued studying hiring discrimination for years and have repeatedly found evidence that race can influence hiring outcomes. That's important because meritocracy assumes opportunity arrives after performance. But if opportunity is being filtered before performance is evaluated, then effort isn't the only variable in this equation. Now, is it? And as a Black woman, this conversation has always felt strange to me. Because I didn't get the benefit of being told, just work hard and everything will come to you. I was told I had to work hard. And then I had to work harder. And then I had to collect credentials. And then in the process of collecting those credentials, I had to be better than everyone else in my class to receive just a little bit of what they may receive. Then I had to collect experience. But in that experience, I had to make sure that my hair didn't offend people, that I wasn't the angry Black woman in the room, that I double-checked everything that I said so that my ideas would be valued. Then I learned something that nobody ever mentioned in the sweet motivational speeches that they tried to teach us in school. Sometimes the obstacle isn't effort. The obstacle is perception. Sometimes you're not being evaluated against the standard. You're being evaluated against the stereotype. And those are not the same thing. Black women working full time typically earned about 66 to 69 cents for every dollar earned by white men. That's not just a wage gap, it's a savings gap, an investment gap, a retirement gap, an inheritance gap, a generational wealth gap. Every missing dollar today compounds tomorrow. And it's my job to figure out how to fill in the gap. But if I say that my opportunities don't look the same, then you call me a victim. You say that I'm oppressed. You tell me I'm looking for a handout. When I just want to make sure that my kids have the same opportunities that you get to sit in your ivory tower and complain about me asking for. And that's why meritocracy can feel so frustrating to people like me. Because when the outcomes don't match the effort, the story starts demanding explanations from the wrong people. Instead of asking why the barriers exist, it asks why the person didn't overcome them. And maybe that's the question that meritocracy never wants to answer. Because if hard work is the key, how do we explain the people working the hardest and receiving the least? You remember the home health care aide, the nursing assistant, the warehouse worker, the farm laborer, the people whose bodies are carrying entire industries on their backs. If effort alone determined outcomes, many of those people would be among the wealthiest Americans alive. Instead, Millions are one emergency away from financial crisis. According to Federal Reserve data, a significant share of Americans would struggle to cover an unexpected $400 expense without borrowing money, selling something, or missing a payment. Think about that. One car repair, one ER visit, one broken appliance, and the entire financial picture changes. Does that sound like a country where hard work guarantees security? Or does it sound like a country where security is distributed unevenly? Now, don't misunderstand me. Effort matters. Education and discipline matter. Good decisions matter. Nobody is saying otherwise. The problem is that Americans often talk about effort as though it is the only variable, as though opportunity is evenly distributed, as though history, wealth, and networks don't matter, as though some people aren't spending their entire lives pushing against barriers other people never have to see. Oh, and here's my favorite contradiction. America has no problem in acknowledging inheritance. No problem acknowledging old money, family connections, legacy admissions, networking, nepotism. But somehow, the moment somebody points out structural barriers, we're told everybody starts on the same playing field. Really? Because that sounds less like meritocracy and more like selective memory. Meritocracy is the only game where people insist the race is fair after some runners were allowed to start 3 laps ahead. And somehow, pointing out the head start becomes more controversial than the head start itself. Maybe that's why this conversation needs to happen. Why it matters. Because the myth of meritocracy doesn't just shape economics. It shapes how we see people. If success is always earned, then struggle must be earned too. If wealth is always deserved, then poverty must be deserved. If outcomes tell us everything, then we never have to investigate the process. We never have to ask who got opportunities, who got obstacles, who got second chances, who got written off. We only look at the scoreboard. We never examine the game. The hardest working person I know still isn't rich. Maybe yours isn't either. And maybe that's where we should leave this conversation. Not with an answer, with a question. If hard work alone determines success, why are some of the hardest working people in America still struggling? And if the answer is an effort, what the hell is it? I'm AJ Miller, and this has been You Ought to Know Better, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisks. Good night. Fear. Children are supposed to be innocent. That's the deal. That's the promise. That's why we protect them, Excuse them. Give them second chances. Tell them they have their whole lives ahead of them. Until they're black. Then something strange happens. A 12-year-old becomes a young man. A teenager becomes physically imposing or aggressive. A child is labeled as a threat. And suddenly, innocence comes with terms and conditions. According to researchers at Georgetown Law, black children are often perceived as older, less innocent, and more responsible for their actions than their white peers. Older, less innocent, more culpable. Sit with that. Public perception sees threat where it should see childhood, and suspicion where it should see innocence. The same country that says childhood deserves protection has often struggled to see black children as children at all. And when society stops seeing a child as a child, eventually that child begins to understand it, to anticipate it, to live around it, to survive it. Because our children don't just fear danger. Our children fear their own fear. They learn that fear can be misunderstood, that fear can be held against them, that fear can make them look suspicious instead of vulnerable, aggressive instead of afraid. And that is a burden no child should have to carry. So let's ask a question America has been avoiding for a long time. If we don't see black children as children, what exactly are we seeing? And what happens when those perceptions enter a courtroom? What happens when they enter a police report, a prosecutor's office, or a jury of 12? Because self-defense just isn't about what happened. It's about what people believe happened, what police believe, what prosecutors believe, and what those 12 jurors, who are supposed to be of your peers, but are oftentimes not, depending on who you are, believe. Because the law doesn't simply ask whether a person was afraid. It asks whether that fear was reasonable. And history tells us that America has never agreed when deciding who's dangerous, who's threatening, who's innocent. Tonight, we're talking about self-defense. We're talking about fear. We're talking about perception. And we're asking a question that sits at the heart of justice itself. Who gets the benefit of fear? Welcome to You Ought to Know Better. I'm AJ Miller. This is the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisk. Let's start with the question. Not the legal question, the human one. Who gets the benefit of fear? Because I think most of us assume we know the answer. Everybody. Right? Fear is fear. A frightened person is a frightened person. The law is supposed to be blind. Justice is supposed to be blind. Rights are supposed to belong to everyone. At least, that's the promise. But promises and practice aren't always the same thing. And nowhere is that gap more visible than in conversations about self-defense. Because self-defense isn't really about violence. It's about fear. A person says, "I was afraid." And the legal system responds, "Should you have been?" That question changes everything. Think about how strange that is. Two people can witness the same exact event and walk away with completely different conclusions. One sees danger, the other sees an overreaction. One sees self-defense, the other sees aggression. One sees fear, the other sees an excuse. Same facts, different interpretation. Because fear isn't measured, it's judged. And human beings are doing the judging. Police, prosecutors, judges, jurors, the court of public opinion, people with experiences, people with assumptions, people with blind spots, people with an obscured view of history, whether they realize it or not. And maybe that's where we should start. History. Because America has spent a very long time deciding who should be feared. Not just through laws, through stories, headlines, politics, repetition. If you hear the same story enough times, eventually it stops sounding like a story and it starts sounding like common sense. And common sense can be one of the hardest things in the world to challenge, because most people don't even realize they're carrying it. After the Civil War ended, slavery ended. But America's obsession with controlling black bodies didn't. Black codes emerged in the South. New laws, new restrictions, new pathways into the criminal justice system. Convict leasing. States leasing prisoners to railroads, mines, farms, private businesses. The names changed. The uniforms changed. The justification changed. But the question remained: who belongs? Who deserves protection? Who deserves suspicion? Who gets treated as a citizen? And who gets treated as a threat? That question never really left. It followed us into the Jim Crow era, into segregation, into the, quote, tough on crime era, into the war on drugs, into modern policing. Different century, same conversation. Who's dangerous? Almost anything can be justified in the name of safety. More surveillance, more enforcement, more punishment, more suspicion, and a hell of a lot less grace. That's why I keep coming back to that Georgetown study. Not because it's shocking, because it explains so much. Researchers found that black children are often perceived as older than they actually are, less innocent, more responsible for their actions and choices. Think about that. Not adults, children. A child walks into a room carrying the expectations of an adult, the consequences of an adult, the suspicion reserved for an adult. And then we act surprised when the outcomes look different. Because childhood is supposed to be a shield. It's grace, it's patience, it's protection. It's the benefit of the doubt. It's the assumption that mistakes are part of growing up. But what happens when that shield gets taken away? What happens when public perception sees threat where it should see childhood? Suspicion where it should see vulnerability? What happens when the child who needs protection becomes the person others believe they need protection from? That's not just a social question. It's a legal one. Because eventually those children grow up. Eventually they encounter police officers, prosecutors, judges, jurors. and laws that ask a deceptively simple question. Was the fear reasonable? And now we've arrived at self-defense. Not through a legal definition, again, through a human one. Because before self-defense is a law, it's a feeling. It's the moment your heart starts racing, the moment your stomach drops, the moment your brain tells you something is wrong. The law doesn't create that moment. It only tries to judge it after the fact. And that's where things get messy. Texas courts have recognized that when evidence raises the issue of self-defense, juries should be allowed to consider it. In cases like Dyson v. State and Warner v. State, courts reinforced an important principle. If evidence exists that could support a defensive theory, the jury should hear it. That sounds fair. And honestly, it should. Because rights don't mean much if people aren't allowed to assert them. But getting a self-defense instruction and winning a self-defense argument are not the same thing. Because evidence still has to be interpreted. Fear still has to be interpreted. And interpretation requires people. That's why researchers have spent decades studying perception. Researchers like Joshua Carell and Jennifer Eberhardt found that race can influence perceptions of danger. Not always, not in every situation, not for every person, but often enough that researchers kept finding similar patterns. And that should make us uncomfortable, not defensive, uncomfortable. Because it is fear that is the foundation of self-defense. And if fear is the foundation of self-defense, then perception matters more than we'd like to believe. So to make it practical, imagine two people walk into a room. Before either person says a word, your brain has already started making assessments. Safe, unsafe, familiar, unfamiliar, threatening, not threatening. Humans do this constantly. It's part of survival. The problem is that survival instincts don't always distinguish between perception and reality. And when those perceptions are reinforced by centuries of stories about who is dangerous, those split-second judgments can have long-term consequences. And if perception influences how we see people, shouldn't we expect it to influence how institutions interact with people too? Researchers with the Stanford Open Policing Project analyzed more than 100 million traffic stops across the United States. 100 million. And what they found raised difficult questions about who gets stopped, who gets searched, and who gets viewed with suspicion. The Department of Justice found similar concerns when it investigated Ferguson, Missouri. Black residents made up about 2/3 of the population, yet they accounted for the overwhelming majority of stops and arrests, about 94%. Now, statistics don't tell us everything, but they do tell us where to start asking questions. And these numbers raise a question that should sound familiar by now. Who gets the benefit of fear? Because over-policing isn't about one officer, one traffic stop, one department. It's about exposure. More contact, more stops, more searches, more opportunities to create suspicion. And if one community experiences dramatically more law enforcement contact than the other, should we expect identical outcomes? No. The same question appears when we look at incarceration. America is home to roughly 4% of the world's population, yet houses around 20% of the world's incarcerated people. One nation, 1 out of every 5 incarcerated people on earth. That didn't happen because Americans suddenly became 5 times more criminal. It happened because of choices, policy choices, political choices, legislative choices, choices often made in the name of safety. And don't get me confused. Safety matters. It matters a lot. Every parent wants their child to be safe. Every community wants to feel secure. Every person wants to get home at night. The question isn't whether safety matters. The question is what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve it. And who pays the price when we get that calculation wrong? Because sometimes the price is measured in years. Sometimes it's measured in freedom. Sometimes it's measured in wrongful convictions. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, innocent Black Americans are significantly more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder than innocent white Americans. Sit with that. Sound familiar? Sound like something that we recently experienced? Not guilty people getting harsh sentences. Innocent people convicted in prison, sometimes for decades. Those cases force us to confront something uncomfortable. The justice system is made up of human beings with opinions, flaws, biases, and human beings who are capable of making mistakes, sometimes life-changing ones. Which brings us back to where we started. Children, fear, perception, humanity. Because I don't think this conversation is really about self-defense. Not entirely. It's about recognition. The ability to be seen fully. To have your fear recognized. Your vulnerability and your innocence acknowledged. Your humanity seen. Because when a society struggles to see your childhood, it will often struggle to see your fear. And when it struggles to see your fear, it may struggle to recognize your right to defend yourself. A society that sees threat where it should see childhood will inevitably struggle to recognize that child's fear. That's not a political statement. That's a human statement. Children are supposed to be innocent. And that's where we started tonight. And that's where we're going to end. Because public perception has a habit of seeing threat when it should see innocence. And suspicion where it should see vulnerability. Danger where it should see fear. Our Black babies shouldn't have to fear their own fear. They shouldn't have to prove their innocence before they receive empathy. They shouldn't have to prove their humanity before they receive protection. And they shouldn't have to grow up wondering whether the world will see them as children before it sees them as threats. Because childhood is not something that should have to be earned. And innocence is not something that should have to be negotiated. I'm AJ Miller, and this has been You Oughta Know Better, the podcast where we read the fine print, check the receipts, and investigate the asterisks. Good night. Hello. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Please let me know if you can hear me. Please let me know if you can hear. Perfect. All right. I just want to let everybody know that is You Ought to Know Better. That is my podcast that I recorded myself. I write them myself. It is my personal creation. If you like what you heard tonight, please feel free to go and follow the links in my bio. Follow me on Spotify, on iHeart. Thank you so much, Megs. Follow me on Apple Podcasts. Also, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube. I also upload the debates there, and I also upload my podcast there. And as always, guys, as I leave you guys with every single night, if you don't have enough sparkle today, take your time. I'll be here when you're ready. Sprinkle some into this dark ass world. We can definitely use your light. And as always, my friends, in a world full of jackasses, never forget to be a unicorn. Thank you guys for listening with me tonight. And thank you for taking the time to support me. I love you all. And I will see you tomorrow on both YouTube and TikTok. Good night.